Hey everybody, Gromlos here with another little simulator battle video. In this video I got a short fight from the Henan province event from earlier this week. Now it seems the Henan event is portraying the Sino-Japanese War. I have to say though that I am not sure what time frame exactly the event means to portray. But the available planes in this event are for Russia, which portrays the Chinese in this event, the I-15 and I-153 biplanes, the I-16 Type 18 and the Leg 3. And also sadly the SP-2 bomber again, which with the current state of the bomber damage models usually causes problems in the lower tier events. For the Japanese we have the A5M and the KR-43 Hayabusa, the premium HE-112 and the P5N2 bomber. I hope in the future the plane set in this event gets adjusted a bit to better portray the air forces involved, but for now there are a few nice planes in the lineup I'd like to fly. I flew one mission in the premium HE-112. That is after all one of my favorite planes and I usually fly it when I get the chance, even though it is not the most historically accurate in this setting. And one battle in the I-16 Type 18. The battle in the I-16 was the more interesting one of the two, so let's take a look at this small encounter. Now the I-16 is a plane I have not flown in quite a while, but it is an interesting plane and I always like the look of the short stubby fuselage. The primary fighter opposition for this plane in this event is going to be the Ki-43 Hayabusa, the plane that I flew in my last simulator battle video, so let's compare the two a bit. The I-16 was, when it first entered service in the mid-30s, a very modern design. A low-wing monoplane with retractable landing gear was unusual at the time. For its time the plane was very fast, yet as usual for modern designs, had a higher wing loading and would not turn as well as more traditional designs, which at this time were still mostly biplanes. Of course, back then the development of fighters moved along very fast, and a few years later it was the other way around, with the new monoplane designs entering service that would outperform the I-16 in terms of speed, but would not turn as well. The newer Hayabusa is however built with maneuverability in mind and very lightweight for its size. So the wing loading of the KR-43-2 and the I-16 Type 18 is on a somewhat similar level, and on higher speeds the plane's turn capability is similar, but the lighter I-16 has certainly the edge when it comes to turning at lower speeds. And both planes roll very well. The Hayabusa has of course a more powerful engine and is quite a bit faster than the I-16, though because of the lower weight the I-16 Type 18's power loading is not that much worse. Also the I-16 thanks to its short fuselage has a tendency to be a bit twitchy. Now let's take a look at the fight. I spotted multiple planes and moved towards them. One turned out to be a Leg 3 and the other one a Hayabusa attacking an AI TB3 bomber. It's the only enemy I can see at this point, though I thought I might have seen a second Hayabusa as I approached. But since this one is the only one I can see right now, I get behind it to attack. Since the Hayabusa was focused on the bomber, I could get into fire position pretty easy. One thing about the I-16 though you can see here is that it does not have an elevator trim. This makes aiming with this plane, especially at a little higher speed, somewhat unstable, as you can see here. Now after I got that Hayabusa, I look around and immediately spot a second one that is coming in for an attack from behind, and I turn into him and go into a semi-split S to evade his fire and have the advantage if he wants to initiate a turn fight. I turn after him, but for now it does not seem the Hayabusa wants to turn and instead moves away again. The Hayabusa is of course faster than I am, so if he keeps going I will have a hard time catching up to him. I check my 6 real quick to make sure I don't have another one sneaking up on me, but as soon as I look forward again the Hayabusa went into a split S and is coming my way again. I want to follow with a split S of my own, but just as I start to do so the Hayabusa moves into the dead zone created by the horizontal bar in my windscreen. He is not reappearing where I expected him to and I lose him in the ground clutter. So I loop around and try to spot him below me, but the AA firing at me confuses me a bit, because at this point I am assuming that I am over friendlies, so I thought the AA is firing at an enemy right behind me and I try to spot said enemy. However, after taking a look at the map I can see that I am as a matter of fact above enemy troops, so there is no enemy fighter behind me and the AA is shooting at me, not someone behind me. Of course, while I was trying to detect the imaginary fighter, the Hayabusa I was after initially took this opportunity to go on the offensive again. I wanted to turn into him again using both elevator as well as rudder, which works pretty well on the I-16, but this time I overdo it and the plane goes into a spin. After recovering, I keep diving a bit towards the ground to build up some speed I have lost in the spin, and then look for the Hayabusa again, which I expect will try to come in from behind one more time. And indeed, the next time I look back I can see him approaching from my 4 to 5 o'clock position with a slight altitude advantage, and I turn sharp to the right to evade, and then, as I see him pass behind me, reverse and turn back to the left into him. The Hayabusa that came in with a little bit more speed overshoots, and now I am behind him. He then dives to the ground and I follow. Now the Hayabusa is of course faster than I am, so I start to fire a few bursts after him. That is a pretty high distance for rifle caliber guns, but I hope this way he will keep maneuvering to evade my fire so I can keep up with him and maybe even start a turn fight. Here you can also see again how the lack of an elevator trim makes aiming somewhat unstable at higher speeds in this plane. As I've explained in an earlier video, you want to trim your nose down a bit before an attack at higher speeds, so you don't have to press the nose of your aircraft down with the stick to stay on target, as this makes your aim unstable. And this is what you can see here. When I have to pull up to get the sight on target, it remains stable, but the nose of the plane gets light at this speed, so I often have to press it down with the stick, and then you can see the instability. Also, if you press down too hard, your engine may stutter because of the negative G-forces. That is the disadvantage of not being able to trim the elevator. Now, despite the jinking, I could not get closer to the Hayabusa at first, but then he made a tight turn which allowed me to close the distance enough to fire more effectively and start to get more consistent hits. It now appears the enemy plane is just trying to get away in a somewhat straight line using its speed. Maybe he also took too much damage to continue jinking effectively, but at the closer range without the jinking it is also easier to get hits, and eventually one of the bursts gets the Hayabusa's fuel tank and sets it on fire. Now, the Hayabusa has rubberized fuel tanks to reduce the chance of fuel leaking, but they are not as effective as self-sealing fuel tanks many Allied planes had. And in this case they are not good enough to starve the fire, and the Hayabusa goes down. Now, I used up a good amount of ammunition and I also took a hit earlier, so I want to fly back to the airfield and rearm before returning to the fight. Now, I played this game pretty early, just after noon, not exactly prime time, so there were not as many players in it. And by the time I got back from rearming, there were only 2 other players left. One enemy fighter, another Ki-43 and the SP-2 on my team. When I returned from rearming, I spot the plane at somewhat high altitude. I'm not sure where the SP-2 is at this point, but the plane appears to be the enemy fighter from its size, and I would also not expect to see the SP-2 up this high. So I'm reasonably sure that it is the Hayabusa, and that assumption is confirmed as the friendly AA opens up on it. The Hayabusa also spots me and is coming my way, descending from slightly higher altitude. The Hayabusa apparently does not want to go for a head-on attack, a sensible decision as I have a pretty good armament, but when I see that he will pass below me, I pull up before he passes me. The Hayabusa passes below me and then turns sharp to his right, and from my position with the nose pointing up, I can use the rudder to move in behind him pretty fast. A maneuver the I-16 with its short fuselage is pretty good at. The plane performs well in vertical maneuvers like this. Now, I am on the tail of the Ki-43, but the situation is still somewhat of a stalemate. I can turn at least as well as he can and stay on him, but the Ki-43 is faster and has more energy and a slight altitude advantage at this point. He could of course use his superior speed to get away, but I guess he wants to settle this right here as much as I do. I could use my flaps to turn tighter, but that would of course be somewhat pointless in this situation, as I can turn tight enough for the situation I am in right now without them, and I want to keep my energy up as much as possible here. It appears the Ki-43 is mostly doing high yo-yo turns, followed by pressing the nose down with the rudder and building up speed in a dive, followed by going up into another turn after that. And I try to fly in such a way to intercept him when he comes down from the dive and try to slowly gain on him, to eventually get a hit on him when he comes down. Now, that might take a bit, but luckily for me I know that the Ki-43 is the last plane on the enemy team. Usually I would be worried here because it seems the fight might take a long time, and that of course would give other fighters the chance to come to the aid of the Ki-43, but since there is nobody else I can take my time. Now one thing that does start to worry me a little bit here though is altitude. In a fight like this, both planes of course continuously trade altitude for speed to keep their speed up at acceptable levels while turning. So the fight is slowly taking place at lower and lower altitude, and eventually the altitude will run out. Now the plane that runs out of altitude first and therefore has to pull up and fly straight first will be at a disadvantage. At the moment, because of the high yo-yo turns of the Ki-43, he is above me for about half of the time, and the other half, when he's diving down, he's below me. That's about a 50-50 chance to be the first to run out of space. So, since my intercept him while he comes down tactic does not seem to produce results fast enough, I think about changing it up a bit and instead try to gain a permanent altitude advantage, and when the Hayabusa gets too low, he has to level out and I got the advantage. At this time the SP-2 bomber on my team makes an appearance, but luckily he does not stick around. Instead he moves away and does what bombers are supposed to do and searches and kills ground targets. I appreciate that, as it might have cut an interesting fight short if he would have played gunship instead. Now, as you can see here, when the Hayabusa comes down again, I no longer try to intercept him right away. Instead I try to keep my altitude up before turning after him. I don't try to get my sights on him. This way I hope to gain an altitude advantage over him so that he runs out of altitude first. But while doing so I get a bit too slow and stall the plane. That turns me around and I am now facing the Hayabusa that is coming up for an attack. I try to get some hits on him too, but miss. However, this has actually put me in a better position and I can get behind the Ki-43. That is something I have to remember for the next time when I am in a fight like this in the I-16. I can use a stall like this on purpose to break up a stalemate. As with the last Hayabusa, I keep firing bursts to keep the Hayabusa on its toes and not to tempt him to fly straight, as I could not catch him in this case. I get a few hits in every now and then, and according to the slight smoke trail I managed to get the engine, so I hope he will slow down soon. Now, you might have noticed that I am overheating my engine a lot. I did notice the overheating engine during the fight, but the thing is, on most planes in War Thunder that is currently not that much of an issue. Especially when you have an air-cooled radial engine. It will cool down pretty fast when you put the engine into idle for a little bit, and as long as you do that before the timer runs out, you're usually fine. There are only a few exceptions to that rule, like the Spitfires where you have to be really careful because the engines take forever to cool down. But in most planes in the game currently, it just does not matter that much, and I wanted to keep my speed up as high as possible to get closer to the Hayabusa and shoot it down. And eventually I get a good hit in and the Ki-43 catches fire, and in case of the Hayabusa that usually means that the plane is lost. But I stick with him a little while longer just to make sure that the fire is not going out. But it does not and the Ki-43 goes down, and this is it for this mission. I actually found the I-16 to be pretty enjoyable to fly, even though aiming can be a bit twitchy without elevator trim, and I think you can do some nice maneuvers with this plane. I think I might fly it more often in the future when I get the chance, and see what I can do with it. I also want to try the later cannon-armed variants. Now, I wanted to fly the Ki-43 in this event as well, but at the time I was playing, the waiting times were pretty long, because not that many people were queuing up for the Japanese, and I ran out of time. I suspect that this is because of the SP-2 bombers that are also available to fly in this event, and that can cause some frustrations for the people flying the weakly armed Japanese lower tier planes. That may have caused a few people not to queue up for the event for the Japanese planes. I do hope that this will improve after the damage model changes that are announced for the next big batch. Well, and this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was entertaining, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.